Coming up on tonight's This Week in Politics.
Our message today is based upon our policy review and the national discussion of the things that have come out since the death of Mr. Floyd. We stand up very well on that, and we're proud and want to be transparent about that to our citizens and our community.
Sioux Falls police say they reviewed their policies and procedures and found no problems with how they interact with people of color. In Minneapolis, the epicenter of the policing reform movement, the police chief there says reform is coming following the death of George Floyd.
This will not be the same MPD that they are accustomed to. We have an opportunity to create a new MPD, and we must.
In Washington, the president signs an executive order that, among other things, creates a database to keep track of police officers with a history of using excessive force, but also says he will use the power of the White House to resist any calls to defund police departments as a way to solve this civil rights problem.
We have to find common ground. But I strongly oppose the radical and dangerous efforts to defend, dismantle, and dissolve our police departments.
Another busy week of fast-changing developments. Let's get right to it. Good evening, everyone. I'm Brian Allen. The president has support in his stance that law enforcement agencies nationwide cannot be defunded as a way to bring rogue officers in line. That includes Iowa Senator Joni Ernst, who says Congress must invest more money in solving this problem, not less.
There is a lot of talk about defunding the police. And I know that that's a quick and provocative soundbite, but I think there are other ways that we can go about reforming police. I do believe that we can add additional support for our police, whether it's the form of mental health counselors, those that specialize in de-escalation.
There are currently 2 policing reform measures that have seen the light of day in Washington, one in the U.S. House that would ban the use of chokeholds like the one responsible for the death of George Floyd. It would also mandate body camera use for all police officers and make lynching a federal crime.
We don't need a study about chokeholds. We don't need a study about no-knock warrants and the rest. We know what we need to do. We don't need a window dressing toothless bill. We need to take action that is real.
On Wednesday, the House Judiciary Committee approved that plan, meaning it could be heard on the full House floor as soon as this coming week. That debate contentious, as evidenced by this exchange between California Democrat Eric Swalwell and Florida Republican Matt Gaetz.
Can anyone on the Republican side say unequivocally Black Lives Matter?
Unequivocally, all lives matter. Why is that a problem to acknowledge?
Reclaiming my time. I think it's clear that my colleagues on the other side would like to put up a straw man to not have the uncomfortable conversation that we need to have about race.
Following that exchange, an interjection from Texas Republican Louis Gohmert.
Every life is precious, God-given, and Black Lives Matter, unequivocally.
The subject of George Floyd, racism, and policing reform was one of the issues facing Vice President Mike Pence. He visited Iowa this week to discuss COVID-19 response with Governor Kim Reynolds. Pence signaled the White House response would be to support some sort of reform, while also not losing sight of those who have been responsible for violence during protests, like what we saw May 31st here in Sioux Falls.
What happened to George Floyd was a disgrace. But the protests, the violence, and the rioting that took over protests around the country was also unacceptable to the American people.
With the president and vice president signaling the need for reform, and with Democrats moving ahead with their measure in the U.S. House, the Republican-controlled United States Senate is also moving forward with a measure of their own called the Justice Act, which would increase federal reporting requirements for officers who use force and encourage chokehold bans by withholding federal funding for departments that use them. The measure is the work of the only African-American member of the U.S. Senate, Tim Scott of South Carolina, who tried to define the difference in why reform is needed.
We're not a racist country. We deal with racism because there's racism in the country. Both are mutually true. They are both true, not mutually exclusive. So
it is anticipated that the Justice Act will be brought to the full floor of the United States Senate this coming week as well. Senate leaders, as you might imagine, are gearing up for a fight.
Democratic friends, if they want to make a law and not just try to make a point, I hope they'll join us in getting on the bill and trying to move forward in the way the Senate does move forward when it's trying to actually get an outcome rather than just sparring back and forth.
What's clear is that the Senate Republican proposal on policing does not rise to the moment. The Democratic bill has a ban on no-knock warrants in federal drug cases, while the Republican bill only requires data on no-knock warrants. The Democratic bill has a publicly available nationwide database on misconduct, so that abusive police officers who are fired can't simply go to another department somewhere else in the country and get hired. The Republican bill would keep such information almost entirely shielded from public view.
Already in the Senate, lawmakers from our region lining up behind their party lines. South Dakota Republican Senator John Thune voicing support for the Republican-backed Justice Act.
Too many Americans feel unsafe right now. Too many Americans live in fear that what happened to George Floyd could happen to their own fathers and sons and brothers. Too many Americans see in law enforcement officers individuals to be feared rather than trusted. Americans are ready for all of that to end. They want reform and increased accountability. They want to make sure that we are holding our law enforcement officers to the highest standards.
Minnesota Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar on the floor of the Senate saying something must be done right now to fix a justice system that she says has been broken since it was created, and that she wants reform that allows the nation, her state of Minnesota, and the city of Minneapolis to heal.
I want justice now. The voices you hear from across the country, they want justice now. It is time we deliver, and not just in platitudes. It is time we act and not just talk about acting. This is our moment. This is history. So let's make history.
And welcome back to This Week in Politics here on KSFY. This week saw a landmark ruling from the United States Supreme Court to protect LGBTQ people from job discrimination. The court voting 6-3, ruling that the Civil Rights Act does indeed cover gay and transgender workers. The White House had argued that the Civil Rights Act did not extend to claims of gender identity or sexual orientation. Many states had previously not protected LGBTQ+ workers from workplace discrimination. Now they will be protected federally. The ruling specifically targets Title VII, which bars job discrimination because of sex, and now encompasses bias against LGBTQ+ workers. We were able to speak with Cody Engel with Sioux Falls Pride for some reaction.
It's really exciting to see the justices uphold this, and even reading their opinion, seeing their thoughts on it has been really encouraging. As a gay male especially, seeing what our Supreme Court thinks and how they want to ensure that, civil rights and civil liberties are being protected under the Constitution.
In other news, Sioux Falls City Councilor Teresa Staley is now officially calling for a recount in the race for her at-large council seat. Staley filed that official paperwork a little more than a week ago. She lost to Alex Jensen by 109 votes. That amounts to less than 0.5% of all the votes cast. Staley, a registered Republican, has chosen former U.S. Attorney Randy Seiler to represent her on the recount board. Seiler is the chair of the South Dakota Democratic Party.
Our city government in Sioux Falls is supposed to be nonpartisan. That means that we don't wrap ourselves around any particular party.
In addition to Randy Seiler representing Teresa Staley on that recount board, Alex Jensen has selected state lawmaker John Hanson. The first meeting of that recount board is set to happen this coming Wednesday. It was also Election Day in the community of Brandon this past week. Voters in 3 wards casting their ballots to decide if the city of Brandon should allow fireworks within city limits, and voters did say yes. That clears the way for 1.4G fireworks to be shot off in city limits. Now, those would include multiple shot aerials, rockets, Roman candles, and fountains. Here's a look at the results. 867 for fireworks, 627 votes against. Also, voters in Ward 3 elected a new council member, Jack Parliament, earning 372 votes to TJ Cameron's 218. When This Week in Politics continues on KSFY, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz speaks out on a century-old hate crime that took place in northern Minnesota. We will be right back here on KSFY. And welcome back to This Week in Politics here on KSFY. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz honoring a painful episode in his state's history this past Monday. He marked the 100th anniversary of an infamous lynching of 3 black men in Duluth. In Duluth in 1920, a white mob broke into prison and lynched 3 men accused of raping a white woman. But according to the Minnesota Historical Society, there was no evidence against them. A 4th black man, Max Mason, later served 5 years on rape charges, but there has always been doubt about his guilt as well, and he was posthumously exonerated last week. The lynching sent shockwaves nationwide and led to an exodus of black residents from the city of Duluth.
This is a story of who we are. Without this story, and as I said Friday, without the connection to Mr. Clayton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. McGee, and Max Mason, it's easy then not to see that there's a direct line that descends down for 100 years to George Floyd laying on the streets in 38th in Chicago. And the inability to face the systemic issues of racism, of inequalities, of educational attainment gaps, of home ownership gaps, of healthcare gaps, and to be very Minnesotan about it and just not really want to talk about it because it's a painful conversation. I want to be here to say thank you to this community for not going in that direction and having that healing conversation, creating that space down there that after the murder of George Floyd, that space was probably needed more than anything in this city. And that is because of the vision of people who understood that.
And we are out of time now for tonight. I'm Brian Allen. Thank you for spending part of your evening with us. We will be back next Sunday night at 10:30 right here on KSFY. We hope you can join us then as well. As always, from all of us to all of you, good night, everyone.